She was 38 and out of work by the end of a Tuesday morning. Two men laughed when she asked for her wages. She had no husband, no children, no savings worth counting, no letter of character, and no trade the town would put a name to. What she had was a folding rule of boxwood and brass that had belonged to her father, Samuel Cartwright, dead 11 years. They owed her £9 and 4 shillings, and they paid her with a key. The key opened the old wayhouse outside the east gate, shut up for 9 years. Roof open to the sky, doors swollen fast, the yard gone to grass. But what the chairman of the market committee did not know was that on the great beam inside that building, under 16 years of dust, there was something that should not have been there. It would not only change what Jane Cartwright was worth, it would change what every sack of grain in the county was worth. If a place ever paid you off with something it called worthless, tell me about it in the comments, because I do read them. On a Thursday in the middle of November, a grain dealer named Thomas Bell carried a tabletop balance through the east gate, set it down on the bench in the clerk's room, and asked Jane Cartwright to tell him he was an honest man. He was 51 years old. He had sold corn in that town for 26 of those years, and 2 of his customers had been telling people at the pump that his 14 pounds came home light. Jane took the 14-pound weight down from the rack. She set the balance on the bench, laid her straight edge across it, packed a folded card under the near foot until it sat true, and put the weight on the pan. The pointer came to rest and stayed there. It was short, not by much, and not by any amount a customer would have noticed in a single sack, but it was short, and she put a second weight on and watched it settle short again in the same direction. "That old machine of yours is the thing that's wrong," Bell said. She did not argue with him. She wrapped 3 of her father's weights in sacking, put them in a market basket, and walked back through the east gate into the town with the basket bumping against her knee. At Isaac Rowe's butcher shop on Cross Street, the 14 pounds came up short. At the coal yard by the bridge, it came up short. At Fanny Pie's cheese shop in the Shambles, where the balance was 4 years old, it came up short. At the corn factor's stall at the top of the market hall, where the machine was so new the brass had not gone dull, it came up short. Then she took the 28-pound weight out of the basket, and the shortfall was not 2 ounces but 4. 5 scales, made by different hands, owned by different men, standing in different shops, and every one of them wrong in precisely the same direction. Jane Cartwright knew enough about balances to understand what that meant. Wear could make a scale wrong. Rust could make it wrong. Carelessness could make it wrong. Chance did not make 20 scales wrong alike. She stood in the middle of the market hall with the basket on her arm and looked down the 2 long rows of stalls, at the balances on the counters and the platform machines at the ends of the aisles, and she counted 41 of them without moving her feet. It had started 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in October, in the committee room above that same hall. Jane Cartwright had been raised on weights and measures the way other children are raised on scripture. Her father, Samuel Cartwright, had kept the old public wayhouse outside the east gate for 22 years, and from the time she was 6, she had stood in the yard beside him while the carts came in off the Newark Road. He taught her to read a beam before he taught her to write a fair hand. He taught her that a balance tells you nothing at all unless it is standing level, that a knife edge wants oil and not grease, and that a man who reads a scale from the side of the pointer instead of the front of it will be wrong by a small amount all his life and never know it. He gave her the folding rule on the last Christmas he was alive, in a kitchen with the door open onto the yard because the fire smoked. It was boxwood, with brass at the joints, and it had his initials scratched into it near the hinge. He was not a man for speeches, and what he said when he put it in her hand was this: "A scale will tell you the truth about a thing, but only if somebody first tells the truth about the scale." She was 27 then, and had been married 4 years to a carrier named Joseph Hale, a steady man with a bad chest. She was Jane Hale in the parish book and Jane Cartwright everywhere else, because in Ashcombe, a name attached to the wayhouse outlasted a name attached to a husband. Joseph died of a fever in the spring of 1859. There were no children, and she went on working. By 1866, she had been 17 years in the market hall, and she knew things about it that were not written down anywhere. She knew that the platform machine at the north end read a trifle heavy in wet weather because the boards under it swelled. She knew that Robert Vane, the corn factor, always rounded a half hundredweight up in his own favor and would argue about it pleasantly for 10 minutes. She knew which of the 3 machines wanted oiling. She weighed wool and grain, coal and potatoes, hides, sacks, crates, and the odd crate of geese, and she wrote the figures in a ledger with a hard pencil that she kept in a small brass holder in her pocket. Nobody in the town called her a weigher. What they called her when they wanted her was the woman who keeps the figures. The committee met on the first Tuesday of the month in the room above the hall, and on the first Tuesday of October, they reorganized the market. There were 5 of them at the table, and the fire had not been lit. Edmund Rankin, the chairman, was 57, a wool factor with a house on the Nottingham Road, in a habit of reading a paper through while somebody was still speaking to him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Outside the door, on a bench in the passage, a young man named Arthur Neame sat with a new ledger under his arm and his hat on his knees, waiting to be called in. Rankin said that the accounts of the hall were to be kept henceforth by a single clerk under the surveyor, and that the various weighing and recording duties would be gathered into that office. Jane asked whether the office was hers. "The new arrangement has no place for your position," Rankin said, and turned the paper over. That was the whole of it. Nobody shouted at her. Nobody put her into the street. One of the men at the table asked whether the fire had been ordered for the following week, and another said something about the price of a load of coal. And Jane stood there for a moment longer than she meant to, and then she went down the stairs past Arthur Neame, who was 23, and stood up politely as she passed. She went back to the weighing office at the north end of the hall, tied her ledgers into a bundle, and sat down for a minute on the stool she had sat on for 17 years, because her legs had gone strange under her. The money was the next thing. Jane went back up 2 days later and asked for what was owing to her, which was £6 and 11 shillings of unpaid quarter money, and a further £2.13. The hall had held back the previous spring when the roof was mended and everybody's pay was docked to help meet it. £9 and 4 shillings altogether. She had the figures written out on a half-sheet, and she left the half-sheet on the table. The committee did not dispute the sum. That was the part she had not expected. Rankin looked at the paper, agreed the arithmetic was correct, and said that the hall's account was low and that the surveyor's office had been an expense, and that the committee proposed instead to grant her the use of a piece of the borough's property. They meant the East Way house. They had been trying to be rid of it for 4 years. It stood 150 yards outside the east gate on a strip of ground the borough could not sell because of a right-of-way. It had been shut since the new hall opened, and every year it appeared in the accounts as a liability, and every year somebody said that something ought to be done about it. The offer was the use of the building and the yard for 7 years at a rent of 1 shilling a year, on the condition that she keep it wind and watertight and pay the rates. Robert Vane, who was 52 and had a red face and a good laugh, said that at least she would have somewhere to weigh the rats. He got his laugh. Rankin did not join in, but he did not stop it either, and he was still looking at his paper when Jane said that she would go and see the building before she answered. She walked out that same afternoon with the key in her hand. It was a big key, and the wart of it was orange with rust, and it took her both thumbs to turn it. The doors had swollen, and she had to put her shoulder to them. Inside, the light came down in bars through the holes in the slates, and the floor under the holes was green. The plaster on the north wall had come away in sheets. There was a platform weighing machine sunk into the floor at the center of the room, with a skin of rust over the plate and a dead sparrow on it. A great beam overhead, iron hooks on chains, a rack of counterweights with 2 of them on the floor. There was a small clerk's room at the front with a boarded window and a desk with a drawer swollen shut, and on the desk a stack of freight ledgers gone soft as bread. The yard behind was to her waist in dock and nettle, and the stone cartway had sunk in 2 places where the ground had washed out beneath it. By the door, somebody had painted a word on the brick a long time ago, in letters a foot high, and the weather had taken most of it. "What was left of it," said you unserviceable. Jane stood in the doorway for a while. She was not thinking about treasure, and she was not thinking about the committee. She was looking at the beam, because even under 16 years of dust, she could see that it was a good one. She went back the following morning and signed the paper in the surveyor's office, and Rankin signed it after her, and the clerk wrote the date on it, the 9th of October, 1866. Then she walked out to the east gate and locked the door behind her from the inside, which she had never in her life done to a building before, and stood in the dark, listening to the pigeons moving about in the roof. She began with the roof, because there was no sense in cleaning a room that was still being rained on. Slates came from a yard on the Newark Road at 2 shillings and 3 pence, the dozen, seconds, with a few broken corners among them. She bought 4 dozen and a bundle of laths and a keg of nails, and paid a carter named Dick Havers, who was 70 and who talked to her for 20 minutes about a horse he had owned in 1840, to bring the lot down to the gate. She went up the ladder herself, and she found that watching a man do a thing is not the same as doing it. Her first attempt failed. She pointed the ridge with a mortar she had mixed too lean, because lime cost money and she had been careful with it, and it looked well enough for 9 days. Then the wind came round to the northeast on the Saturday night and took 3 slates off the western slope, and when she came down on the Sunday morning, there was water standing on the clerk's room floor, and the top 2 of the old freight ledgers were ruined past saving. She stood and looked at that for a good while. Then she carried the wet ledgers out to the yard, went back up the ladder, raked the bad mortar out with the point of a trowel, mixed a new batch at 1 part lime to 2 of sand and slaked it properly, and did the whole of the western slope again with copper nails instead of the iron ones she had been given. It took her 4 days and cost another 11 shillings. It did not leak again. That is what she was doing in the 2nd week of October, when the rest of the town had already stopped thinking about her. Have a guess now, before she does. 41 balances in 1 market hall, made in different years by different men, and a woman standing between them with a basket of her father's weights. What could possibly be wrong with all of them at once, and in exactly the same direction? Hold on to whatever answer you have, because Jane held on to the wrong one for a fortnight, and the thing that finally broke it open was sitting on a shelf in a workshop 2 streets away with dust on it. She cleaned the main room next, working from the top down. She swept the beam with a long brush, and the dust came off it in a gray rope and hung in the light. She lifted the dead sparrow out with a shovel and buried it in the nettles. She scraped the rust off the platform plate with a wire brush and oiled it, and found that the plate was sound and that the trouble lay underneath, in the levers under the floor, where the pit had silted up with 16 years of chaff and mouse nest and rain silt. What she found in the building was not remarkable. It was chains and hooks and a rack of iron standard weights from 100 weight down to 2 pounds, most of them still bearing the borough stamp. It was a bundle of loading tickets from 1852, tied with tape, for wool and lime and firebrick, in her father's hand. She sat on the edge of the platform and read 4 of them, and then she put the tape back round them and set them in the drawer. The thing she wanted was the beam. It was an equal arm balance of the old sort, 16 feet from end to end, hung from an iron stirrup in the roof truss, with a hanging pan on chains at one end and a platform hook at the other. It had been made in Nottingham in 1839, and her father had used it every working day for 22 years, and it had been left hanging in a wet building for 9. She spent 5 days on it. She got the pans down and scrubbed them. She took the knife edges out one at a time, which meant rigging a rope and a block and lowering the beam onto trestles, and cleaned each edge with fine oil on a scrap of soft leather until the steel came up bright, and looked along each one against the light. One had been chipped. She dressed it back with an oilstone, slowly, checking it against the rule every few strokes. She found a stretched link in the near chain and had a smith on Bridge Street, Cyrus Peel, 64, make her a new one for 4 pence. Then she hung it again and leveled the bearing plate with a plumb line and a wedge, and put 14 pounds of her father's iron on the pan. It swung and came back and settled dead true. Thomas Bell came on the Thursday of the following week, with his balance on a handcart under a horse blanket. The trouble had started with a widow named Susan Teal, 26, who took in washing on Gate Street and who had bought seed corn from Bell for her hens. She had waited at home against a 14-pound weight her husband had left her, found it light, and said so at the pump. 2 other people had said the same thing within the week. Bell had come to Jane because his father had known her father, and because there was nowhere else in Ashcombe with a beam in it that did not belong to a merchant. Jane set his machine on the bench, packed the near foot until her straight edge sat true across the frame, and put 14 pounds on the pan. It read short by about 2 ounces. Bell said what he said about her old machine being the thing that was wrong, and she let him say it, and then she took the weight off and put 28 pounds on instead. It read short by about 4. She stood looking at that for longer than Bell liked. Then she went and fetched the 56-pound weight from the rack, and she had to carry it against her hip with both arms, and she set that on the pan and watched the pointer come to rest, a little more than 8 ounces light. Rust does not do that. Rust and dirt and a stiff bearing make a scale sluggish, and a sluggish scale is wrong by roughly the same small amount whatever you put on it, and wearing a knife edge is much the same. What Jane had in front of her was an error that grew with the load and grew in step with it, so that doubling the weight doubled the shortfall as neatly as if somebody had worked it out on paper. She wrote the 3 figures on the flyleaf of a receipt book in pencil. 14, short 2, 28, short 4, 56, short 8. Is it wrong or is it not? Bell said. It is wrong, she said, but not in a way you did. He did not understand that, and she did not explain it, because she did not yet understand it herself. She told him to leave the machine with her, and he would not. And in the end, he took it away on the handcart, and she watched him go up the road with it and stood in the doorway with the pencil still in her hand. Then she wrapped 3 weights in sacking and went into the town. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon, she had put her father's iron on 5 other people's scales and got the same answer from all of them. She did not sleep much either. What she did the next morning was go back and do the whole of it again, properly, because she had done it wrong the first time. She had not leveled a single one of them. She had walked into 5 shops with a basket and set her weights on whatever was standing there, and the floor of Isaac Rowe's butcher shop ran downhill towards the drain by better than an inch and 6 feet, which she had known for years without ever having a reason to think about it. A scale standing out of level will lie to you, and it will lie by an amount that has nothing to do with anything else. Every figure she had taken on the Thursday was worthless. So she went round again on the Friday with the straight edge, a plumb bob and a box of thin card packing, and she asked each man's leave first, and wrote his name and the date at the head of a fresh page, and leveled every machine before she touched it. Isaac Rowe was 48 and let her do it because he thought it was funny. Fanny Pye, 55, who had sold cheese in the shambles since her mother died, stood over her the whole time with her arms folded. Walter Hollis at the coal yard, 39, was busy and told her to get on with it. At the top of the market hall, Robert Vane looked at her basket and looked at her and said he supposed there was no harm in it and made his remark about the rats, which nobody laughed at because it was the second time. The figures came out the same as before. That was the part that mattered. She had suspected her own carelessness. She had gone back and taken the carelessness out, and the answer had not moved. Over the next 9 days, she tested 22 machines in Ashcombe, and she did it quietly. And she paid for the privilege in some cases with a shilling or a civil word, or by weighing something for a man for nothing. Not all of them were wrong, and that was the thing that gave her the shape of it in the end. The great beam in her own building was right. The scale in the back room of the Bell and Anchor, bought second-hand from a chandler in Newark in 1848 and cracked across one pan, was right to within 1/4 of an ounce. An old steel yard in a barn at Netherfold was right. A pair of small brass scales belonging to a druggist on Bridge Street were right, and he was pleased about it and told her at some length about a nephew of his who had gone to Australia. But every machine that was wrong in the same direction and by the same proportion. And when she sat down at the desk in the clerk's room with the pages in front of her and began to sort them, she found she could put the whole of it into 2 columns. In one column were the machines that had been in the same shop, untouched, since before 1860. Those were right. In the other were the machines that had been bought new, or repaired, or taken away and re-verified at some point in the last 6 years. Every one of those was short. She checked that 4 times. She went back out to 3 of the shops to make sure of a date. Fanny Pye's balance had gone away in the winter of 1862 with a bent standard and come back in the spring. Rose had been bought new in 61 and never sent away since. Hollis had bought his in 64. Bell's had been in for repair twice. Jane sat with the 2 columns and a candle and did not go to bed until she had written across the top of the page, in the flat hand she used for other people's ledgers, the words that seemed to her to be the honest description of it. Something happened to the scales of this town about 6 years ago. She was careful. She was more careful than most people would have been, and it made no difference at all, because Fanny Pye had a sister, and the sister had a lodger, and the lodger drank in the Bell and Anchor. By the last week of November, it was all over Ashcombe that the woman who had been turned out of the market hall was going about the shops, saying the scales were crooked. Nobody heard it the way she had meant it. She had said, to the 4 or 5 people she had said anything to at all, that a number of the machines appeared to be reading light and that she could not yet account for it. What came back was that Jane Cartwright was calling the tradesmen of Ashcombe thieves. She understood, once she had time to think about it, why it went that way, and she could not entirely blame them. If she was right, then Thomas Bell had been handing over short measures of seed corn for years without knowing it, and so had Rowe with his beef and Hollis with his coal. Every farmer paid by weight in that hall since 1860 had possibly been paid short. Every invoice was in question, and every carriage charge reckoned by the hundredweight, and the railway company reckoned everything by the hundredweight. There was no version of it in which somebody was not out of pocket, and once a man has understood that he will never be paid back for 6 years of small mistakes, he would very much prefer the mistakes not to have happened. The Merchants' Association met on the 2nd of December in the upper room of the Bell and Anchor. Jane was not invited and did not expect to be. What came out of it was a short letter to the market committee, signed by 9 men, which said that a person lately dismissed from the hall was making assertions injurious to the trade of the town, that no evidence had been laid before any proper authority, and that the committee ought to consider whether such a person was a fit tenant of borough property. Rankin came out to the east gate himself on the 4th. He came on foot, in a good coat, and he stood in the doorway rather than come in, and he looked at the new slates on the western slope for a moment before he said anything at all. He said that he had no wish to be unpleasant, and that the lease carried a condition, and that conditions of that sort were understood to include the good name of the borough, and that a tenant who set the market by the ears might find the committee taking a view about it at the spring meeting. Jane asked him whether he had read the figures. Rankin said that he was not a man of science and that the town had inspectors for that sort of thing, and that if the machines of Ashcombe were unlawful, then the inspector would have found it, and the inspector had not found it, and there the matter rested. Then he wished her good day and walked back up the road, and she watched him go and then went in and shut the door. The work went on because it had to. She had £11 and some odd shillings left of the small money she had saved out of 17 years of quarter payments, and she was spending it at a rate that frightened her when she wrote it down. She had the pit under the platform machine dug out and the levers cleaned and reset, which took 6 days on her back in the wet with a lamp and a bent wire and cost her a new pair of boots. She had the swollen doors taken off, planed down and rehung by a joiner named Ned Bramble, 33, for 15 shillings including the timber, and he did the work in a day and a half and told her twice that his wife said she was in the right of it. 2 people brought her work in that fortnight. One was George Ashby, 62, who farmed at Netherfold, who did not care what the association thought, and who brought in 3 loads of oats and paid her 2 pence a load, and stood in the yard afterwards looking at the beam and saying that his father had weighed hay on it. The other was Martha Crowe, 61, who sold pies from a basket at the East Gate, who came in out of the rain twice a week to sit on the platform edge and eat her own stock and tell Jane about her son in Leicester, and who never weighed anything at all. The obvious answer was the weights, and Jane spent a fortnight on it. That is the thing that goes wrong most often, and the thing that is easiest to do on purpose. A man who wants to take a little off every sail does not touch his beam. He files a hollow in the underside of a weight, or he drills it and fills the hole with lead and blacks it over, and a customer could handle that weight every day for 10 years and never think anything of it. So she went round again, and this time she did not test the machines. She tested the iron. She took her own set on a barrow and asked each man to let her lay his weights against hers on the great beam at the East Gate, and 11 of them agreed, mostly out of curiosity by that stage. She weighed 63 pieces of iron in 9 days. 4 were light, 3 of those from rust and knocking about, and the 4th was a 14-pounder of Hollis's that had lost a chip out of one edge and that he had known about for a year, which left the awkward part, and she went and dealt with it at once, because everything she had done for 6 weeks had been measured against her father's iron, and her father had been dead 11 years. She carried the set up to the town hall on a Monday morning and asked leave to compare it against the borough's own, and after a good deal of standing about in a passage, she was taken into a small room where the substandard weights were kept in a mahogany chest, compared against the county standards at Nottingham once a year as the law required. Her father's 14 pounds agreed with the borough's 14 pounds. So did the 28 and the 56 and the 7 and both of the 4-pound pieces. Jane walked back down the hill with the barrow and understood that she had spent a fortnight proving that she had nothing. The iron of that town was as good as the county's, and the county's was as good as the exchequer's. And more than 20 machines in the borough were reading light in proportion to their load. The truth of the matter was that she had been looking for a dishonest man, because that is what everybody looks for, and there was not one. She went to Thomas Bell at the end of that week and asked him to lend her his balance and let her take it to pieces. And Bell, who by then had been called a thief at the pump twice more, said she could take it to pieces and keep the pieces. She had it on the trestles by the Thursday. She got the pan chains off and the pointer and the cheeks, laid the beam bare, and went over it with her father's rule and a pencil. The beam was sound. There was no lead in it, no filed notch, no packing under a knife edge, and the counterweight at the end of the pointer was unmoved and still had the maker's punch mark under it. What she found, on the 3rd day, was that the marks were in the wrong place. The graduations along the arm, the little chiseled lines that told a man what he was reading, did not fall where the shape of the beam said they should fall. Across the whole arm, it came to less than the thickness of a shilling, and it was perfectly regular, and every mark was as neatly cut as the next, which is not what a fraud looks like. A fraud is done in one place. She sat down with the pencil and worked at it for most of an evening. And then she did the one test that settles it, which her father had shown her in the yard when she was 9 years old. On a wet day, using a brick, she hung 14 pounds of burro iron on the left and balanced it with shot on the right until it sat true. Then she took both off and put them back the other way, about the iron on the right and the shot on the left. It did not balance. It was out by about 4 ounces, which is twice 2. There is only one thing that does that. If the two arms of a balance are of exactly equal length, swapping the load from one side to the other changes nothing at all. If one arm is longer than the other by even a hair, the beam will lie to you by the same fraction of whatever you put on it, and swapping the sides makes it lie the other way and doubles the difference so that you cannot miss it. Belle's beam had one arm longer than the other. She went out and did the same test on the next 4 machines she could get leave to touch, and every one of them was long on the same side. Nobody had tampered with anything. The machines had been made wrong. There were 2 men in Ashcombe who made and mended scales, and one of them had only set up in 1865, and the other was Ward's, in a yard off Bridge Street, where they had been at it for 3 generations. Jane went through her pages that night with a candle and made a list of every machine she had found short, and against each one she wrote where it had come from or where it had been sent, and it took her about 10 minutes to see it. Belle's beam had been to Ward's twice. Fanny Pie's had gone there in 62. Hollis had bought his new from Ward's in 64. Rose had come from Ward's in 61. And the corn factor's new machine at the top of the hall had been on the bench in that yard 9 weeks earlier. The ones that were right had come from Newark, or from Nottingham, or from nowhere at all because they were 40 years old. Elias Ward had been the best scale maker in that part of the county and had been dead since 1863. Jane had known him a little. He had come out to the weigh house twice in her father's time to dress a knife edge, a slow, exact old man who did not like to be watched while he worked. His son Peter was 34 and had run the yard since his father's last illness, and when Jane walked in on the 8th of January, he already knew what she had been saying about the town, and his face closed up before she had finished the first sentence. She did not accuse him of anything. She asked him one question, which was how a beam was laid out in that shop. Peter Ward said what any man in the trade would have said. A new beam was set out from the shop's master bar, which was a length of iron with the center and the 2 arm points marked on it, and every beam that came off the bench was laid against it, and every beam that came in for repair was checked against it before it went back. That was the whole security of the trade. The master bar did not change, and so the work did not change. Jane asked when the master bar had last been made. He did not answer for a moment. Then he said that there had been a fire in the spring of 1860, which everybody in Ashcombe remembered because it took the roof off the yard and half the loft with it, and the bar had come out of it warped and scaled and useless, and his father had been 68 and ill by then, and the man who made the new one from the old was a workman named Josiah Fenn, who had been in the shop 40 years and had died in 64. Then he went and fetched it, because he was not a dishonest man, and because a part of him had wanted somebody to ask. They laid it on the bench under the window. It was a bar of iron 4 feet long with 3 seats cut in it, blackened with handling, and one end of it still carried a faint scorch where the fire had been. Jane opened her father's rule and measured from the center seat to the seat at one end, and then from the center seat to the seat at the other, and she did it 3 times and let Peter Ward do it twice himself. The center was not in the center. It was out by about 1/32 of an inch on a 2-foot arm, and no eye alive would have caught it, and a man working from a scorched scribe line on a burnt bar in the week after a fire, with an old master dying in the house and the customers wanting their work, would have set it exactly where Fenn had set it and gone home to his tea. Every beam laid out in that shop since the spring of 1860 had been given one arm slightly longer than the other, and every beam brought in for repair had been checked against the same bar and passed as correct. 6 years of work, none of it meant to cheat anybody, the whole of it reading light in proportion to the load. The machines were not in league with one another. They were children of the same wrong ruler. Peter Ward sat down on the bench with the bar in his hands and asked her what he was supposed to do now. That was the 8th of January, and Jane Cartwright still had no standing in the matter whatsoever. She was a woman with a lease, a beam, and 11 weeks of pencil figures. She could not condemn a machine or compel a man to bring one to her, and if she had gone about the town on her own word, she would have been argued with for a year and beaten in the end. So she wrote to the inspector. Charles Dunn was 49 and had the weights and measures of 4 market towns and a good deal of country between them, and he came into Ashcombe once a quarter and stamped what was brought before him and went away again. He answered her first letter with 2 lines saying that complaints were properly made through the borough. He did not answer the second. What moved him was a paper signed by 19 farmers, got up by George Ashby over 3 weeks of market days, saying that the men who grew the corn of that district had reason to doubt the machines they were paid by. Dunn came on the 29th of January, and he was not pleased. He said, in the yard at the East Gate, with his coat still on, that he had been dragged 12 miles into a quarrel between a dismissed clerk and a market committee. Jane did not argue with him either. She had spent 9 days preparing, and she had everything laid out on the platform, and what she gave him was not an opinion. She gave him the 14, the 28, and the 56, all 3 compared against the borough's substandards with the clerk's initials against the date. She gave him 11 machines she had arranged to have brought to her yard, and a list of 19 more standing in the town. She gave him the 2 columns, and the dates, and the reversal test, and she made him do that last one himself on Bell's beam, twice. Dunn stopped talking about the 12 miles somewhere in the middle of the second hour. He went to Ward's yard in the afternoon with the county substandards out of his own case, and he measured the master bar himself with a beam compass, and he was there until dark. What came of it took most of February. 26 machines in Ashcombe and 11 more in 2 villages were marked, withdrawn from use, and either adjusted or broken up. Peter Ward made a new master bar under the inspector's eye from the county standard length and recut 9 beams for nothing after that, which cost him the best part of a year's profit and saved his father's name in the town. Edmund Rankin fought it to the last week. He wrote to the inspector on behalf of the committee to say that the market's own machines were beyond question, and he proposed at the January meeting that the hall's platforms be quietly sent to Nottingham for adjustment before any test took place, which Dunn found out about and stopped in 1 letter. On the 9th of February, with the thing already decided, he sent Jane a formal notice that the committee would consider the condition of her lease at the spring meeting. She read it, wrote the date on the back of it, and put it in the drawer with the loading tickets. Because by then the trouble had turned around on the town in a way that nobody on the committee had thought about. There were 37 machines out of use in Ashcombe in the middle of February, and the corn was still moving, and the coal and the lime and the hides were still moving, and none of it could be bought or sold or carried until somebody put a figure on it. The hall's own north platform stood with a board across it, waiting for a fitter from Nottingham, who could not come for 5 weeks. And 150 yards outside the East Gate, in a building the borough had been trying to give away for 4 years, there stood a 16-foot equal arm beam and a platform machine, both tested by Charles Dunn on the 31st of January and stamped with the borough die. George Ashby came first, on the second day, with a wagon of barley, because he had been coming all winter anyway. Jane charged 2 pence for a cart, 4 pence for a loaded wagon, and a penny for a written ticket, which was the scale of charges her father had worked under, and she painted it on a board and nailed the board by the door so that nobody could say afterwards that they had been treated differently. She took 2 shillings and 4 pence on the second day and 11 shillings on the 4th. On the 9th day, there were carts on the road at 7 in the morning waiting for her to unlock, and she stopped writing tickets in pencil and had a book printed at Loughborough, 500 in duplicate, for £1 2 shillings. She took on Ellen Snow in the last week of February. Ellen was 15, the 4th of 7, quick at figures and slow at talking, and Jane paid her 4 shillings a week and taught her the way she had been taught, by making her stand and watch and touch nothing for 2 days. The cartway went next, relaid and rammed with stone in April at a cost of £6.15, and the doors were painted a dark green in May. In June, Ned Bramble cut a hatch through the front wall of the clerk's room and hung a shutter on it so that a carter could hand in his docket and take his ticket without either of them standing in the rain, and the hatch alone saved her something like an hour a day. She built a rack for the weights along the south wall in July and stamped a number on each hook. In September, Hollis and Sons signed for their coal to be weighed at the East Gate for a year at £3.10. In October, the Midlands freight agent, Samuel Peach, 38, looked at the yard and the road and the stamp on the beam and signed for the company's town traffic, and after that, the drays came whether the market was busy or not. Edmund Rankin came out on a Friday afternoon in November, 13 months after he had told her that the new arrangement had no place for her position. There were 3 wagons in the yard when he arrived, and he had to walk round the back of the second one to reach the door. Ellen was at the hatch with the book. A farmer from Neasall was leaning on the sill, signing his ticket and complaining about the price of straw. The beam was swinging, and the platform machine was ticking the way it did, and a horse was steaming in the cold. Rankin waited until the farmer had gone. He said that the committee had reconsidered the arrangements at the hall, that the surveyor's office had not answered, and that there would be a weighing office again in the spring at £30 a year, and that the committee wished her to have it. Jane looked past him, out through the open door, at the yard. "I believe I already have a position," she said. He stood there a moment. Then he said that he would tell the committee, and he put his hat on and walked back up the road towards the gate, and she watched him go, and then turned round because Ellen wanted her about a figure. Robert Vane came in December with a wagon of seed corn on his way to Newark, because the haul machine was busy and he was in a hurry and there was nowhere else. He did not say anything about rats. Jane weighed the wagon loaded and weighed it again empty, wrote both figures and the difference in the book and on the ticket, tore the ticket out, and handed it through the hatch to him. He read it and put it in his coat and said, "Thank you," and drove out. 15 months after she had first put her shoulder to those doors, on a morning in the middle of January with frost in the ruts, the Eastway house stood with a new slate roof, clean glass in 4 windows, a green door, a stone cartway that did not move under a loaded wagon, and 11 carts on the road outside waiting their turn while the horses steamed in the cold. Jane Cartwright weighed the first of them at 7:30. Ellen wrote the ticket. The second was a load of fire brick and the third was hay. On the brick by the door there was a patch about a foot square that she had left alone when the rest of the front was pointed and washed, and on it you could still make out 4 or 5 letters of a word that somebody had painted there a long time ago. The plasterer had offered twice to take it off. She had told him twice to leave it. Her father had told her that a scale will tell you the truth about a thing, but only if somebody first tells the truth about the scale, and at 27 she had taken that to mean a person ought to keep her machines honest. It had taken her another 11 years to hear the rest of it, which is that somebody has to do the telling, and that it will not be the man who owns the scale, and very often it will not be anybody who is paid to. She had been 38 years old, put out of work in 4 minutes, owed £9 and 4 shillings she never saw a penny of, and handed a ruin instead by men who thought they had settled 2 nuisances in 1 afternoon. There was no sum of money in that county she would have taken for it. Ashcombe had spent 6 years trusting its scales because everybody trusted them together. Jane Cartwright had done the one thing nobody else thought to do. She had measured them.